This story is about a clash that has shaken the basketball world. A clash not just between two names, but between two mindsets, two eras, and two very different ideas of what the game should represent. And it all began when a legendary player made a statement about a young prospect that instantly changed the tone of the conversation. Because when Shaq openly said that Bronny was not ready for the NBA level, it wasn't just a casual opinion, it became the spark that slowly turned into a full-blown fire, and what followed pushed this situation far beyond simple criticism into something much bigger. Because on the same night that LeBron James signed a new deal with the Lakers, his son Bronny was selected as the 55th pick in the draft, and that is where the real questions started to surface. Since historically, the 55th pick is not where stars are born, but where careers usually struggle to even begin. It is a spot that rarely guarantees anything, where most players either fight through years of uncertainty or quietly fade away. But this time, the situation looked very different, because Bronny didn't just get drafted, he received a contract that carried security and guarantees that most players in that position never see. And that is what made people pause, because when you actually look at the numbers, the picture becomes even clearer. His college performance showed limited production, low scoring averages, inefficient shooting, and a relatively small impact on games. Yet despite that, he was given an opportunity that countless hard-working players chase for years without success, and that naturally raised a critical question. Was this purely about talent, or was there something else influencing the outcome? And then came another revelation during draft night that added even more weight to the situation. Reports suggested that certain teams were discouraged from selecting Bronny, being told that if they did, he might choose to play elsewhere instead of joining them. And that made it evident that this was not just a normal draft process, it was something carefully shaped. And seeing all of this unfold, it was inevitable that someone like Shaq, who had built his legacy through dominance and earned respect, would react strongly, because for him this was never just about one player. It was about the integrity of a system that once demanded excellence above everything else. And as the season progressed, Bronny's performance continued to be closely examined, and the numbers did not silence the critics. Low-scoring output, inconsistent shooting, and minimal impact only reinforced the doubts, while at the same time players who could have contributed more effectively were released or overlooked, making the situation even harder to ignore. And that is where Shaq's frustration became more direct, because in his view, this was not simply a developmental case, it was a clear example of standards being compromised. And his words reflected that concern, pointing toward a deeper issue within the structure of decision-making. And then the discussion took another turn when LeBron made comments suggesting that today's NBA is more difficult than previous eras, a statement that did not sit well with many former players who had experienced a completely different level of physicality, intensity, and competition, because in their time, the game was played with fewer protective rules, more physical contact, and a constant demand to prove oneself, and that contrast made the argument feel inconsistent to many observers, including Shaq, who responded by highlighting the contradiction, questioning how the league could be considered tougher while simultaneously allowing a player who is not fully ready to secure such a stable position. And that contradiction became one of the central points of this entire debate, turning it into a larger conversation about how the game has evolved and whether those changes have altered its core values. And as this discussion expanded, it became clear that Shaq was not alone in his perspective, because multiple analysts, former players, and commentators expressed similar concerns, emphasizing that while opportunity is important, it must align with readiness. Otherwise, it creates imbalance, and that shared viewpoint added credibility to the criticism, showing that it was not driven by personal bias, but by a broader observation of the situation. And the tension escalated further during a public moment when LeBron confronted a media figure over comments about Bronny, an interaction that symbolized how sensitive and complex the situation had become. Because at that point, it was no longer just about performance. It had turned into a debate about fairness, influence, and accountability, and gradually the entire narrative shifted from an individual case to a reflection of a changing system, one where traditional expectations are being challenged and redefined, and that shift is exactly what creates discomfort among Those who experience the older structure of the game, where every opportunity had to be earned through relentless effort, where reputation followed performance, not the other way around. And now that contrast is at the center of this story, because it forces a fundamental question. Is this evolution a natural progression of the sport? Or is it a departure from the principles that once defined it? And that question is what keeps this debate alive and intensifies its impact, because it goes beyond a single player or a single decision. It speaks to the direction in which the game itself is heading. And if you have a clear perspective on this situation, it becomes important to voice it, because discussions like these shape how such moments are understood and remembered, and staying connected to these developments allows a deeper understanding of not just the events themselves, but the larger meaning behind them, which is exactly why this story continues to draw attention and provoke strong reactions across the basketball world. As this situation continued to unfold, the tension didn't just remain between a few voices, it expanded across the entire league, turning into a debate that touched players, analysts, and fans alike, because what initially looked like a single controversial decision slowly began to reveal deeper layers that made the story far more complicated than it first appeared. And one of the most critical turning points came when more insiders and former professionals started speaking openly about what they were seeing. Because at that stage, it was no longer about speculation. It was about patterns that were becoming impossible to ignore. And among those voices was Stephen A. Smith, who had been consistently pointing out concerns about Bronny's readiness, focusing on his numbers, his development, and the pressure that comes with being placed in such a high-profile position without the necessary foundation. And while his criticism initially seemed like standard media analysis, everything changed during a live game when LeBron approached him courtside and confronted him directly. And that moment instantly shifted the narrative, because it showed that this issue had moved beyond basketball discussion into something personal and emotionally charged. And what made it even more significant was the context surrounding it, because reports indicated that attempts had already been made behind the scenes to influence how the topic was being covered, suggesting that there was an effort to control the narrative before it reached this public stage. And when that effort didn't succeed, the confrontation happened in full view of cameras, turning a professional disagreement into a defining moment of the entire controversy. And from there, the conversation only grew louder, with more former players stepping forward to share similar perspectives, including Charles Barkley, who made it clear even before the season began that Bronny was not ready for the NBA level, emphasizing that while he respected LeBron's career, this particular situation did not reflect well on him. And that statement carried weight, because it came from someone who had no direct involvement in the situation but understood the standards of the league at the highest level. And he was not alone, because other voices echoed the same concern, pointing out that the issue was not about denying opportunity, but about maintaining fairness, because every roster spot represents years of effort from countless players trying to reach that level. And when that balance appears disrupted, it naturally raises questions about the integrity of the process. And this is where the conversation started to shift toward the broader implications of the decision, because it was no longer just about Bronny's performance. It became about how such decisions affect team dynamics, locker room culture, and overall accountability. Because in a competitive environment, consistency in standards is what builds trust. And when exceptions are perceived, that trust can begin to weaken, and reports began to surface suggesting that some players within the organization were privately expressing frustration, not necessarily targeting individuals, but questioning the situation as a whole, because from their perspective, the expectations placed on them did not appear to be applied equally across the board. And that creates a difficult environment for any team to function effectively, especially one with championship aspirations. And at the same time, analysts like Michael Wilbon highlighted how the media's handling of the situation also played a role, suggesting that excessive focus on a developing player at the expense of more impactful contributors was not beneficial for the sport, because it shifts attention away from performance and toward narrative, and that distinction is crucial in maintaining the credibility of competition. And as the season progressed, the numbers continued to tell a consistent story, showing limited production and gradual improvement that did not yet match the level required for significant impact, and that kept the discussion active because it reinforced the original concern that the opportunity may have come before full readiness. And then another aspect of the situation began to draw attention, which was how Bronny's development was being managed, particularly in relation to G League assignments and game participation, because reports suggested that his schedule differed from that of typical developing players, raising additional questions about whether the usual pathway for growth was being followed, and for players who rely on that system to prove themselves, such differences become difficult to ignore because the G League is widely seen as a proving ground where consistency, effort, and resilience determine progression, and any deviation from that structure can be perceived as an uneven playing field, and that perception is exactly what fueled further criticism from veterans like Shaq, who viewed these developments as a sign that the league's traditional standards were being diluted, and his response reflected not just frustration, but a sense of concern about what this could mean for the future of the game, because for players of his era, every opportunity had to be earned through sustained performance under pressure. And that expectation shaped their entire approach to competition. And when those expectations appear to shift, it creates a disconnect between generations, with one side seeing evolution and the other seeing compromise. And that contrast became one of the defining elements of this ongoing debate because it highlighted how differently the same situation could be interpreted depending on perspective. And as more voices joined the discussion, the idea that this was simply personal criticism became increasingly difficult to support because the consistency of the concerns pointed towards something more systemic, and that realization pushed the conversation even further, forcing people to consider not just what was happening, but why it was happening, and whether similar situations could arise in the future. And that is where the story takes on a broader significance. Because it is no longer confined to one team or one player, it becomes a reflection of how influence, reputation, and opportunity intersect within professional sports, and how those factors can shape outcomes in ways that challenge traditional expectations. And that is exactly why this situation continues to generate strong reactions, because it touches on fundamental ideas about fairness, merit, and the meaning of competition itself. And at this point, it becomes essential for viewers to engage with the discussion, to analyze the facts, the performances, and the context, and to form their own perspective based on a clear understanding of all sides involved, because only through that process can a balanced view emerge. And if you have been following this closely, this is the moment to share your thoughts and explain where you stand on this issue, because your perspective adds to the conversation and helps shape how stories like this are understood moving forward, and staying connected ensures that you do not miss the next developments in a situation that continues to evolve with each passing moment. As the controversy reached its peak, the conversation shifted from individual opinions to undeniable consequences, because by this stage, the impact of the entire situation was no longer limited to debates on television or social media. It had started to reflect directly on the franchise, the locker room environment, and even the perception of the league itself. And what made it more intense was the growing realization that this was not a temporary headline, but a situation with long-term implications, because when a decision challenges the core principles of merit and competition, it leaves a lasting effect on how the game is viewed. And that is exactly what began to happen as reports emerged about declining fan engagement, with many longtime supporters expressing frustration over what they believed was a shift away from performance-driven decisions toward narrative-driven ones. And for a franchise known for its legacy, its championships, and its high standards, this kind of reaction carried serious weight because it indicated that the issue had gone beyond internal criticism and had reached the audience that ultimately defines the success of the sport. And at the center of all this was still the same question that started it all: whether the opportunity given was justified by readiness, or whether it represented an exception that disrupted the balance of fairness. And as more details surfaced about the day-to-day structure surrounding Bronny's role, including how his development schedule was being handled and how his participation differed from that of other players in similar positions, the perception of inconsistency only became stronger because in professional sports, structure and discipline are not just expectations, They are the foundation on which trust is built, and when that foundation appears uneven, it creates tension, not just among fans, but within the team itself. And that tension is difficult to manage, especially in a high-pressure environment where every decision is scrutinized and every performance is measured. And this is where Shaq's reaction reached its most direct form. Because after observing everything that had unfolded, from the draft process to the performance numbers to the management decisions, he made a statement that resonated across the basketball world, making it clear that in his view, prioritizing a personal storyline over competitive excellence was a step away from what the franchise once represented, and that statement was not just criticism. It was a reflection of a deeper concern about the identity of the team and the direction in which it was heading. Because for players who built their careers on discipline, sacrifice, and relentless competition, the idea that those values could be secondary to any other factor is difficult to accept, and that is why this reaction was so strong. Because it came from a place of experience and a clear understanding of what it takes to succeed at the highest level. And as the discussion continued, comparisons between eras became more frequent, with many pointing out the differences in expectations, physicality, and the pathway to success, highlighting how in previous generations every roster spot was treated as an opportunity that had to be earned and defended constantly. And that contrast only intensified the debate because it forced people to question whether the current system was maintaining that same level of accountability or moving towards something different. And that question does not have a simple answer, because on one hand, the game has evolved, offering new opportunities and adapting to modern dynamics. But on the other hand, the fundamental principles of fairness and competition remain essential, and finding the balance between those two aspects is where the real challenge lies, and this situation has brought that challenge into sharp focus, making it impossible to ignore. And as a result, it has become a defining moment not just for the individuals involved, but for the broader conversation about how the sport should move forward. Because every major controversy eventually shapes future decisions, influences policies, and redefines expectations. And this one is no different because it highlights the importance of transparency, consistency, and accountability in maintaining the integrity of competition. And as the season continues and more performances are evaluated, the narrative will keep evolving, because in sports, results ultimately carry the most weight. And over time, they have the power to either validate decisions or expose their flaws. And that is what makes this situation so compelling, because it is still unfolding, still being judged, and still influencing opinions at every level. And for those watching closely, this is more than just a story about a player or a team. It is a case study in how influence, expectation, and performance intersect in a modern sports environment, and how those intersections can create both opportunity and controversy at the same time. And that is why it remains important to stay engaged, to follow each development carefully, and to analyze not just what is happening, but why it is happening. Because that deeper understanding is what allows you to form a clear and informed perspective. And if you have followed this entire journey from the beginning to this point, this is where your voice becomes part of the conversation. So take a moment to share your thoughts, explain your viewpoint, and be part of the discussion that continues to shape how this story is understood. And if you want to keep exploring such detailed breakdowns and stay updated on every major development, make sure to stay connected and keep following for more insights as this story continues to evolve.